나무 묘호랭개교 나무 묘호랭개교 나무 묘호랭개교 Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Hi, everyone. I hope you're well, good health, safe, secure. Today we're going to talk about language a little bit. I certainly don't think anyone with ears and eyes today couldn't possibly disagree with the following statement. Which I'm always reminded of something that how could I forget his name? It's right there on the tip of my tongue. He said that language is a virus from outer space. It's a quote from Naked Lunch, a movie that he wrote based on some of his writings. A book. Oh my goodness! How can I not? Anyway. The way language is used today, and not even craftily, not even honed, it's been like this since we've invented language. But lately, in the age of degeneration, language has become a weapon. It's become a weapon that isn't even, as I suggested, skillfully crafted. Used to be propaganda and political rhetoric, even person to person. I don't mean government, politicians. Yes, of course there. But even to one another. The way we manipulate the meaning of words to suit our agendas. It's been around forever, right? If you want a really good example of this, read the Lankavatara Sutra, right? What is it, 88 questions that are posed to Shakyamuni Buddha via a certain person. I mean, after you read this, I remember my frustration as I read this guy interrogating Shakyamuni Buddha with the same freaking question over and over and with a subtle change. Oh, yes, but when you say the, do you mean the, or the? I mean, the way this guy, and, you know, it's a story, but the example given, so profound in the way people can get so attached to words and the dissection of words. And, well, do you, and you could argue, well, he's just trying to get to the meaning. No, he's not. You can tell after a certain point, he's no longer interested in the meaning. He's only interested in demonstrating his prowess at the manipulation of language, and he's totally immersed in that. It's completely egotistical. It is the most flagrant display of self-supremacy, which is the whole problem of Hinayana, by the way. I'll just throw that in. But finally, and I could almost, as you read the Lankavatara, tell me your experience, but I could almost hear Shakyamuni grinding his teeth. And he finally put an end to it. And in so many words told them, hey, you have fetishized language and words to the point where you no longer understand what you're doing, let alone what the point is of what you're doing. He basically hand slaps him with language, tells him, stop being so attached to the words. Try to see beyond the words to what is being discussed, what is being opened, explored. Try to find the meaning. Don't get hooked up on the words. We hear this constantly. And it's just another branch of the same teaching that says, follow the law, not the person. But here it is in language, right? And we live in an age now where language is just, meaning isn't even relevant anymore, right? Because we just spout any kind of language we want, and then we say, well, what that means is, and something could agree with the words, doesn't have to. Everything's a slogan. And a slogan, at least at one point, had the merit of pointing to an issue. But we're rapidly in the age of slogans being just easy to repeat. The meaning, well, that's something we can ascribe on the fly. So look, why do I say all of this? It's not perfectly related to what we're going to read now in the opening of the eyes, Gosho. But it is part and parcel of it. And it's something that, I talk about all the time on this channel, the translation bias, the agenda, known or unknown, unconscious or conscious, of the translators of these writings, of Gosho, of sutras. It's something Buddhism has been addressing since Shakyamuni perished. It's the nature of language, but more so it's the nature of language as a tool by human minds. Ego. And so we have to be careful. We have to be attuned to seeing when something goes off the rails even a little bit. We need to notice that. We can't afford in our Buddhist practice of enlightenment, self-enlightenment, to be drawn off into some mystical, magical derision, misinterpretation, stupidity. We can't afford it. You have to be very conscious. How do you become so conscious? Study and practice. Practice. The more you awaken your mind, the more those deviations, be them intentional or not, will stand out. They'll just go, here I am, big old sore thumb. Oh, that can't possibly be right. But there may be some correctness in it. Let me try to eschew that errant thought and see if their meaning comes out in the attempt. It most likely will. So, all of that is to say, and certainly on the, the opening placard on this video, I made a little statement that might, what's he going to talk about now? What's this about? It's a little different than my usual, right? In the course of my 40 plus years of study and practice of Lotus Sutra Buddhism and study of Shakyamuni, Tendai, other sutras, Nichiren certainly, I haven't been without flaw. I've been unduly influenced by certain people in groups that were constantly feeding me misinformation. And one of the consequences of that was that I realized it pretty quick, pretty early in my practice, and it made me incredibly suspicious. And so if you're anything like me, I had to do my own research. I couldn't listen to what other people were telling me anymore because I couldn't trust it. I had to know for myself. And in doing that, boy, did I discover more and more. It made me appreciate Shakyamuni's teachings that so much more because it was so clear. And I would read different translations of the same book. If you looked at the Lotus Lectures playlist on this channel, I talk about it all the time as I'm talking and reviewing every single chapter of the Lotus Sutra, including the opening, the immeasurable, the Sutra of Immeasurable Meanings or Innumerable Meanings, the opening to the Lotus Sutra, those 3 chapters, right? And then there's the closing sutra. The whole thing, the Threefold Lotus. I made a point. I have like 5 different translations I pulled from, just as a comparative interpretation. Some from the late 1800s, H. Kearns, right? Some modern, just recent in the 21st century translations, and contrast and compare the language, and you could easily see the rhetorical devices. Even though it's an excellent translation, H. Kern is very faithful to the meaning, but the words he used were very familiar to him, coming from, the Church of England, the culture that he was raised in, inculcating these words of Christianity. But he wasn't using them to demonstrate the Christianness of Buddhism. They were just his verbal tools. And it's very glaringly obvious. It's almost, I like that translation more than most because there's a certain honesty to it. Albeit I am very much aware that his cultural bias is coloring the words he's using, but the meaning is there. As time goes by, the craft of deception gets much, much more involved, right? To the point where we have some scholars who will remain nameless for the moment, who want to inculcate magic and mysticism into their translations to try to prove that they're on equal footing with religions and so forth. Man, those are Dairaku no Mao. Those are demons of the lower worlds, yeah? And so, again, perhaps I'm sensitive to it, but I have been accused over the years, not recently, not lately, fairly recently, I've been accused of being, of saying controversial things. Code for, you're calling people out, and that's not very nice. That's not very Buddhist of you, right? Because as Buddhists, we're supposed to be quiet, like children in the Victorian era, seen but not heard. You're supposed to be quiet and calm and not ruffle anyone's feather, especially another Buddhist. Right, because I've had chapter and verse quoted to me about evil monks and how they pretend to be and so forth. I've had that thrown at me. So, I was reading this ahead of time yesterday, after yesterday's video, and I thought, how wonderful. How wonderful that I can quote a brief chapter of Nichiren's actual words. Again, the caution on translation is there, but I think as I read this, you'll see that translation isn't a problem here. Nichiren is so specific, right? And he's interpreting Shakyamuni's exhortations and teachings. So this is a very clear message on how we should conduct ourselves as modern Buddhists in this age of degeneration. We are not Buddhists of the Hinayana. We are not Buddhists of the Theravada, of the Agama Sutras. We are not Buddhists of early teachings that was appropriate for thousands of years ago. We are Buddhists of this era, this age of degeneration. And as such, Know yourself as a Buddhist whose mentor is Nichiren. This is who we're emulating, who practices as the votary of the Lotus Sutra, our exemplar of correct practice. So let's listen to what Nichiren says. Yeah? Chapter 17, Persuasive and Aggressive Means of Propagation. And hopefully as I read this, you'll understand why I prefaced today's video the way I did. Some might say that Nichiren, he starts, who claims that followers of the Buddha of infinite life and Zen Buddhism will fall in the hell of incessant suffering, is belligerent and therefore will fall into the realm of asuras. Nichiren, you're so brash, you're so rude, you're certainly going to fall into the hell of anger, right? Manipulation and anger. They're accusing him outright of being the very embodiment of this lower world of anger. Moreover, it is said in the 14th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, Peaceful Practices, quote, here we go. Do not try to expose the faults of other people or other sutras, and do not despise other monks. It's often quoted. It's been quoted to me. It says so in the Lotus Sutra. You shouldn't do that. Bad monk, bad. Okay. Let's go on, shall we? Therefore, they might wonder whether or not Nichiren has been abandoned by the gods because he has not been following these words of the Lotus Sutra. Okay. Valid question. Let's investigate. In response, Nichiren writes, I would cite the following words of the Mohochikwan, the Great Concentration and Insight by Tiandai, right? There are two opposing ways of spreading Buddhism: the aggressive and persuasive. Such statements in the Peaceful Practices chapter as, quote, do not be critical of others represent the persuasive way, while such words of the Nirvana Sutra as, quote, arm yourselves with swords and sticks and behead those who break the teachings of the Buddha, end quote, much more strong, right? Beheading people because they're breaking the teachings of Buddha. Stand for the aggressive way. Yeah. Though these two ways are opposite in nature, they both benefit people, end quote. Okay. But that's the Nirvana Sutra, right? So you could still argue with Nichiren. So Nichiren pulls out another quote. Grandmaster Miao Lo explains this in his annotations on the Great Concentration and Insight, Facile 10, as follows, quote, regarding the two ways of spreading Buddhism and such words of the Nirvana Sutra as, quote, arm yourselves with swords and sticks, end quote, it is stated in the third facile of the Nirvana Sutra that those who uphold the true Dharma should arm themselves with swords and bows and arrows, even if they will not be able to uphold the 5 precepts and maintain integrity. In other words, that wonderful precept of Buddhist behavior of calm and generosity, bodhisattva, all that. Further, it speaks about the ancient king called Senyo the Great, who is said to have beheaded a Brahmin on the spot when the Brahmin slandered Buddhism. Now, I ended the last video with this caveat. Remember, we talk about shoju and shakubuku, right, as two methods of propagation. And I made the statement that shakubuku is really a method of propagation that is directed to those who know better, those who can't claim ignorance because they're very studied in the teachings either of Shakyamuni or the corpus of what surrounds Buddhism at the time, Brahmins and so forth. These are people who should know the truth and know it better than others who have no background in Buddhism, no study. They're the ignorant, right? Not stupid, ignorant. They just don't know. To people who just don't know, it doesn't serve well to behead them, right? Or chastise them. Shoju, a persuasive method of changing their minds, helping them come to realization. That's shoju. But if you're somebody who's studied and you know, then you should know better. Then when you behave in an ignorant manner, it's not really ignorant. It's poisoning the well. It's breaking the teachings of Buddha. You cannot be allowed to do that because the repercussions for yourself, let alone those you communicate with, are dire. Shakubuku. There's an appropriate time, right? So let's go on. Let's see what Nichiren continues to say. We'll continue with that quote from Miao Lo. Further, it speaks about the ancient king, The sutra, in the second facile, also cites an example, an order issued by a new doctor who found that milk medicine prescribed by his predecessor was doing harm to the people. To prevent people from taking the bad medicine, the order said, quote, anyone who uses it will be beheaded. Pretty significant threat. But he needed to shake people's confidence in this earlier doctor who had prescribed something that could kill them. But sometimes authoritarianism, even though that doctor may not have been wicked, he may just have been foolish, the fact that he was a doctor meant that everyone ascribed powers to this doctor. And even if the new doctor said, don't do that, they would go, yeah, but the doctor before you, he said, we should. So, we'll just do that. Because you're new. We don't trust you yet. Oh, no. If you do that, we'll cut your frickin' head off. Oh, okay. We won't do that anymore. We'll do as you say. It's amazing sometimes what needs to happen in order to awaken people's minds. These are two examples of an aggressive means of spreading Buddhism. Although various scriptures preach many ways of spreading Buddhism, they all come down to these two ways in the end, either aggressive or persuasive. Teaching, right? They're both teaching, but you see the difference, right? Nichiren goes on, in his words and phrases of the Lotus Sutra, Facile 8, Grandmaster Tendai explains the difference between the aggressive means of the Nirvana Sutra and the persuasive means of the Peaceful Practices chapter. Don't worry, I know we're still talking about the Nirvana versus the Lotus, although the Nirvana Sutra is specifically a reinforcement of the Lotus, but I hear you. We will get back to the Lotus. Just hang on. This is Tendai now. Someone asked, quote, the Nirvana Sutra says that those who wish to uphold the true Dharma should befriend themselves with the king, arm themselves with bows and arrows, and crush the enemies of the true Dharma. The Peaceful Practices chapter of the Lotus Sutra, however, says that they should keep a distance from those in power, humble themselves, and be kind to enemies. Is there not quite a difference between the two, the harsh way of the Nirvana Sutra and the gentle way of the Lotus Sutra? Obviously, this question had been asked for centuries, yes? I say in response, Tendai, although the Nirvana Sutra preaches mostly the aggressive means of propagation, it also preaches the benevolence of the Bodhisattva who loves all people just as one loves an only child. That's in there too. You can't just be selective. So it is not that it does not recognize persuasion as a means of propagation. Although the Peaceful Practices chapter mainly preaches the gentle means of propagation, another chapter of the Lotus Sutra says that anyone who does harm to the one who practices the lotus would have his head split into 7 pieces. Ah, yeah, you remember that one? Thus, this sutra also endorses the aggressive means. In other words, each of them preaches one or the other as the situation demands. How would you know that without Buddha wisdom, right? Study. Nichiren goes on, Grandmaster Chang'an, in his annotations on the Nirvana Sutra, explains this, quote, regardless of whether they are monks or laymen, those who uphold the Dharma should not lose sight of the fundamental aim of spreading the Nirvana Sutra, even at the cost of phenomenal aspects such as Buddhist precepts. Sometimes being gentle with good behavior isn't enough. Sometimes you have to take a stand. Upholders of the true Dharma cannot be concerned with trivial matters. Am I going to hurt your feelings? As it is said in the sutra that they may not maintain dignity. In the past, when the world was at peace and the true Dharma could be spread, it was only necessary for them to keep Buddhist precepts, not arms and weapons. Today, however, when the world is full of danger and the true Dharma is hidden, they have to keep weapons, arms, not Buddhist precepts. Regardless of the past or present, if the time is full of danger, they should arm themselves. If at peace, they should observe the Buddhist precepts. Thus, the means of propagation should be chosen according to the condition of the time. It cannot be said to be only one way or another. Now, I've talked about this for years now. There are groups and organizations who think, shakabuku, 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 that's how we're going to do. Well, it depends on the situation. You have to have the wisdom to follow, and it's a moving point, isn't it? I can have a very gentle conversation with somebody about Buddhism who is ignorant of Buddhism, who has a lot of fanciful ideas, and then as we go on in the conversation, they will suddenly let drop that they read some book by some guy of some sect or group, and they will begin an argument that I don't know what I'm talking about because this guy says this. And if they have a point to make and it's legitimate, I will accept that as part of my learning. But if what they point to is obviously a contradiction of Buddhist teaching, now I can't just laugh it away. I have to stand and say, no, you do not understand. Let's go over what that concept actually means so that you can now understand correctly what this teaching is saying. That may seem rude. That may be heard as rude. So be it. You either come to the correct understanding or you go. Because now you've challenged Buddha. Not me, Buddha. Buddha-ness. You are bringing fallacy and contra information into a dialogue about what is clear and pure. You cannot be allowed to maintain that mind because that's a destructive mind. You must be corrected. I'm not going to behead you, but in a sense, I'm going to topple your little mountain of information that you've now claimed you know better. Your false idea of correctness is completely invalid, so let's invalidate it. You see? Now Nichiren continues. As for your criticism that I, Nichiren, am belligerent, I'm afraid that scholars today probably agree with you. Even my own disciples cannot get rid of the same doubts as yours and act just like men of each antica. Despite my repeated admonishments. So I have cited interpretations of Tendai and Mialo above to guard against such criticism. Now, two ways of propagation, the persuasive and aggressive, are incompatible with each other just as water and fire. Yeah. The fire dislikes water and the water hates fire. Yeah, we get it. Those who prefer the persuasive tend to laugh at those who practice the aggressive and vice versa. Right? All they know is shoju. Yeah, but all they know is shakabuku. What both lack is the middle, which is so often the answer in Buddhism, yes? So when the land is full of evil and ignorant people, the age of degeneration, the persuasive means should take precedence. As preached in the 14th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, Peaceful Practices. Notice he singles out ignorant people, people who just don't know any better. Well, they need to be massaged a little bit. They need to be encouraged. Yes? However, when there are many cunning slanderers of the true Dharma, I could think of some. The aggressive means should take precedence as preached in the 20th chapter, Never Despising Bodhisattva. See, there it is in the Lotus. It is the same as using cold water when it is hot and fire when it is cold. Plants and trees are followers of the sun, so they dislike the cold moon. Bodies of water are followers of the moon, so they lose their true nature when it is hot. As there are lands of evil men, as well as those of slanderers of the true Dharma in this latter age of degeneration, there should be both aggressive and persuasive means of spreading the true Dharma. I've said this repeatedly for years. Therefore, to decide which of the two ways we should use, we have to know whether Japan today is a land of evil men or that of slanderers. But by extension, that's the world, yes? Suppose someone asks whether or not it would be effective to carry out the aggressive means of propagation when the time requires the persuasive means, and vice versa. To this question, I would say, it would not be effective. It is said in the Nirvana Sutra, quote, Bodhisattva Kashyapa inquired of the Buddha how his body become an indestructible as a diamond. Shakyamuni responded to Kashyapa, Kashyapa, the Buddha has an indestructible body by virtue of upholding the true Dharma. Kashyapa, I have this eternally indestructible body by virtue of upholding the true Dharma in the past. Good men, in order to uphold the true Dharma, you must arm yourselves with swords and bows and arrows, even if you cannot observe the 5 precepts and maintain your dignity. Even if a Buddhist monk who upholds the precepts tries hard to preach, unless he is able to preach as forcefully as a lion, so on and so forth, and defeats the evil opponents of Buddhism, he would not be able to save himself or others. You should know that such a monk is an idle man. Even if you observe precepts and practice pure conduct, you should know you will not be able to do anything for the protection of Buddhism. On the other hand, should a monk upholding the true Dharma aggressively defeat violators of Buddhist precepts, they would probably all become angry and try to harm him. Even if he were killed, he is worth being called observant of the precepts and liberator of himself and others, because he took a stand, an appropriate stand for the true Dharma. To the end, he fought to make that point clear. Nichiren goes on, and these were quotations of the words of Shakyamuni, right? So Nichiren now says, Grandmaster Chang'an says in his annotations of the Nirvana Sutra, Facile 8, that whether we should adopt the aggressive means of propagation or the persuasive means must be decided according to the condition of the time. And therefore we cannot say one way or another. Grandmaster Tendai says of this in his words and phrases of the Lotus Sutra, Facile 8, it all depends on the time. Sometimes resort to the aggressive means, other times use the persuasive means. For instance, we cannot harvest rice by cultivating rice paddies and planting rice seeds at the end of autumn, right? There is an appropriate time and space for every expression, methodology of teaching. What is the situation? During the era of Kenin, 1201 to 1203, 2 monks named Honen and Dainichi emerged to establish the schools of Pure Land and Zen, respectively. Honen declared that the latter age of degeneration, not even 1 out of 1,000 could attain Buddhahood by means of the Lotus Sutra. Whereas Dainichi maintained that Zen is the essence of Buddhism transmitted distinctly outside of written texts and verbal preachings. So denying Shakyamuni's teachings altogether. They're saying they're the true Buddhists. It's always baffled me how they could claim to be the essence of Buddhism by denying the founder and creator of Buddhism. These 2 false teachings have spread all over Japan. So now you have these people who are all declaring Buddhism as their conviction, but practicing in a way specifically contrary to the Lotus Sutra. Obviously, these people should know better. Yes? Scholars of Tendai and Shingon Buddhism are afraid of the Pure Land and Zen followers and try to cater to their whims, just like a dog wagging its tail in front of its master and mice terrified by a cat. In other words, they're all trying to be good precept-observing monks or Buddhists. So you really shouldn't say that about the Lotus, right? Well, that's not going to work. Preaching in the service of kings and generals, they themselves speak of what would lead to the destruction of Buddhism and the country. Such scholars of Tendai and Shingon Buddhism will fall into the realm of hungry spirits in this life and the hell of its suffering in the future. Even if Tendai scholars reside in mountain forests and meditate on the 3,000 existences contained in one thought doctrine, or Shingon scholars stay in remote tranquility to concentrate on the three mystic practices of finger signs and spells and meditations, how can they attain Buddhahood without knowing whether the time calls for aggressive means or persuasive means of propagation? In other words, they're faltering on their responsibility. It's a great responsibility to be Buddhist. Some people might wonder what is good about accusing those followers of Pure Land and Zen Buddhism, making enemies of them, right? In response, I will cite the Nirvana Sutra, quote, "Suppose there is a virtuous monk who does not accuse anyone of harming Buddhism, does not try to purge or punish him. You should know that such a monk is an enemy of Buddhism. By not calling them out, he becomes complicit because he's tolerating them. Anyone who's following that monk as their teacher and witnesses that monk going, well, they're not right, but let's leave them alone, is going to adopt that same mindset in their own practice, thereby keeping them from their enlightenment. Do you see how this multiplies very quickly? In case the monk accuses such a man, purges and punishes him, such a monk is a disciple of the Buddha who truly follows him. Buddhism, Buddha-ness. Whatever happens to him, what's more important is those who look up to him will see his example and go, oh, we should not tolerate that. That's super, super important. That's how we modify the world. That's how we modify people's minds. By being critically observant of Shakyamuni's teachings. Nichiren's doctrine is all about that. That's Nichiren's whole life. Grandmaster Chang'an explains this in his annotations on the Nirvana Sutra. And with that, we'll close this chapter out. Quote, those who destroy Buddhism are those within Buddhism working against Buddhism, actively or passively, right? Those heartless people who keep friendly relationships with such evildoers by overlooking their transgressions and errors are their enemies. Those who are kind enough to try to correct them are the upholders of the true Dharma and true disciples of the Buddha. To prevent a friend from committing evil is really a friendly act. Therefore, one who accuses those of harming Buddhism is the Buddha's disciple, and one who does not purge those who do evil is an enemy of Buddhism. And that's how he ends this chapter. So, when you find me critical of other groups or organizations for countless reasons, understand that I'm doing my best to be a true practitioner, a true embodiment of the Dharma. I'm emulating Nichiren. I'm emulating Shakyamuni. I am standing strong for the correct practice of Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. The next chapter, be aware of the original vow of Buddhas. So I'm sure that's just going to make the point from a much larger perspective. I hope you found this helpful. Most of all, I hope you found this encouraging. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Thank you for your support. Thank you for liking, and please subscribe so we can get more and more people knowledgeable about the correct practice of Shakyamuni's ultimate teachings of self-enlightenment. With our supreme exemplar and teacher Nichiren. Wonderful bodhisattva that he is. And with that, I look forward to the next one. We're chugging along here with opening our eyes, yes? Thank you again for being here. And I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.